ask yourself, why is the left so crazed about Donald Trump? And where does he fit into the great arc of history? And I think that's really what the book's about. And the bottom line is that our country is in an organized drift towards socialism. It's incredibly well organized. And what Joe Biden's doing right now is a big part of the final steps to socialism. And Donald Trump was a very successful president, but one that was very controversial with the left because he took socialism on.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. Today, my guest is Kevin Hassett, who was former chairman of President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. His new book, The Drift, Stopping America's Slide to Socialism, will be published tomorrow. Welcome back to Washington Post Live, Kevin. Good to have you.
Oh, it's great to be back, David. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the premise of your book, that America's on a path to socialism. I'd like you to just give us what you see as the evidence of that. From what I read, we still have what sure looks like the most dynamic capitalist economy in the world. Our growth has been above 6% recently. Interest rates are low. Investment seems to be picking up. That looks like a pretty resilient capitalist economy to me, but you're obviously concerned. Explain why.
Yeah, that's right. And we certainly aren't all the way there yet. But I think that the key observation is that, Joseph Schumpeter back in the 1920s looked forward to America. He was writing about it in the 1970s or 1980s, where he basically saw an America in the future that would be very prosperous, but that would sow the seeds of its own, the destruction of its capitalist system. And if you look at, and I go into this quite a bit in the book, if you look at Schumpeter's idea of what the world would look like, it very, very much looks like the world of today. And I will talk about specific policies in a sec. But basically what he said was, as we get richer and richer, then Americans are going to send their kids to colleges and universities much more. And colleges and universities are going to be hotbeds of socialism. And he had this whole sort of delightful chapter about why professors tend to be socialists. But they're going to indoctrinate our kids to be socialists at the universities. They're going to control respectability. The best students will go on to have jobs like yours, David, and have major influence over the major media. And before you know it, the sort of socialists, the indoctrinated socialists will control the media, and they'll control the universities, and they'll make defenders of capitalism disreputable. And Schumpeter writes in the end that he thinks that capitalism will die because there'll be nobody left to defend it. And so I think that's kind of like, I think of the book really as being kind of two parts. It's kind of like a long bar conversation, really, with any one of my friends who wonders, what the heck are you doing working in the Trump administration? The first part is, what was it like? And then how did the world respond to what it was like? And then what's the big picture story for why the world responded that way? And so I think that Schumpeter's view of this sort of gradual drift towards socialism and the big institutions that form and beliefs that form because of it sort of explains a lot of the backlash against Donald Trump. Now you're absolutely 100% right, sort of an insinuation of your question, that a lot of people don't know what socialism is, and they call anything that's sort of a mildly progressive policy socialist, and that's completely false. Like, socialism is the government control of the means of production, or the government delivering products to people without the use of the price mechanism. And there are socialist proposals in the U.S. that are extremely socialist, like, for example, Medicare for all, where the government would take over the healthcare sector. But in the end, Venezuela is probably, and in Cuba, the most socialist countries right now. I guess Singapore, is one of the ratings, the Fraser Institute ratings, is the least socialist place. And countries tend to move in one direction or another along that path. The thing that I think is interesting is that in the U.S., we're really, really close to moving way, way down in the rankings. And to put it in perspective another way, with the top marginal tax rate in the current Democratic proposal, that would give the U.S. the highest marginal tax rate in the OECD. And so absolutely, we are sliding in a direction that's really pretty far in the socialist direction, even vis-a-vis European countries.
So I want to just push back and ask you to comment on some of the specific things that are in the news, but I want to start by asking you about something that the leaders of America's largest and most successful corporations, the Business Roundtable, wrote back in 2019. They argued that the unhappiness, disenfranchisement of the American middle class is so significant. People argue that's the reason that Donald Trump got elected. That corporations need to do something about that. They need to take more care for their workers, their communities. You'll remember the statement, I'm sure, but Jamie
Sure.
Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, arguably the leading financial spokesman in our country, said in announcing this that the American dream is alive but fraying. And he argued that corporations need to take more responsibility for an outcome that's in the interests of all of our citizens. Is that the kind of thing that you think is sensible, a sensible response to what's going on, or do you see that as dangerous?
I think that it's certainly sensible to acknowledge the need for society to be more just, and for whether the corporation is the right place to do that. I mean, sure, there would be opportunities for it, but basically, I'm of the belief that corporations should profit maximize, and that profit maximizing corporations are like a key linchpin of capitalism. And it's profit maximization that makes things efficient, drives productivity higher, and when productivity is higher, then wages go higher. When I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, David, that we put out a report and then made a chapter in the economic report of the president on socialism. And one of the things that people on the left do right now is they very often say, "Oh, we just want America to be more like Scandinavia," and I would guess that you could sort of almost paraphrase Jamie Dimon's statement as being, "We need to be more like Scandinavia." But the fact is that socialism doesn't work, and when you pursue strategies other than profit maximization, then you don't maximize productivity and you don't maximize wages. And we got some data. I'm actually just going to look aside because I pulled it up for the interview. But if you look at it, Danish people who work in the U.S. make 35% more in after-tax income than Danish people who live in Denmark. For Finnish people, it's 19%. For Icelandic people, it's 32%, and so on. So that even the Scandinavians, when they move to the U.S., their standard of living skyrockets. So this idea that we can make a utopia. Oh, I'm sorry, I have this thing where my light goes on and off because I'm trying to protect the climate. And so anyway, it's back on now. If I don't move, that happens. But anyway, so this idea that we will become like a utopia if we mimic the European socialists is just incorrect. And I think that the corporate
say, Kevin, if I just interrupt, I think what Jamie Dimon would say and what the many corporate leaders who signed that statement would say is that not that we should be more like Scandinavia, we should be more like America. America didn't used to have such extremes of wealth and poverty. We used to have a strong middle class, and that has been badly harmed. So I think isn't it misstating this to put it in terms of European social democracy? It's really a call to be more like the America that you and I grew up in the 1950s and 60s.
Right. I think the America that we grew up with in the 50s and 60s was basically one where firms were profit maximizing. And I'll flip it around, talk about poverty. So Donald Trump comes in and pursues, very capitalist policies, which I have a lot of inside detail in the book about, what we were thinking in the Oval Office and, how the things became law. And those policies had a massive positive effect on social justice. The number of people living in poverty dropped by more than 6 million, the biggest drop we've had since World War II. Income growth. We said when the tax cuts were passed, you'd get $4,000 a year in income growth. We actually ended up getting 6,000 more. Income inequality skyrocketed, as before President Trump came to office, and dropped sharply when he was in office. And so the point is not to criticize the objective. I think that we should all celebrate that wage growth was higher for people in the bottom decile than the top decile, pre-COVID in the Trump administration, that poverty dropped by more under him than it had for any other president. We should all celebrate that. And I think that the reason why, like think of all the people that tell you income inequality is the number one issue. It's the number one policy issue. We've got to address income inequality. Where were those people when income inequality was dropping? Wage growth for middle class people is the most important thing. Blue collar wages is the most important thing. Well, gosh, they were completely flat during the Obama administration, and they grew sharply. Wage growth grew sharply under Trump, and so I think that you then have to ask yourself, well, if those are really the objectives of the people, then first we should maybe be a little nicer to each other, because hopefully, David, you agree that I share those objectives. I just think that a capitalist society is the thing that delivers it better. Then, basically, I think Trump's policies kind of proved that those things worked, or at least provided additional evidence. Proof is a strong word. And so then you have to wonder, well, why, despite that, is everybody like throwing all those policies out the window right now and proposing things like AOC and Bernie Sanders are proposing that take us very, very radically in a different direction? Shouldn't you at least be curious about why income inequality declined under President Trump? I have a strong theory of why it did.
Kevin, we'll get to the specifics of the policies. I want to ask you about some particular specifics that are in the news. And you, as a prominent economist, I'd love to have your comments on them. First, the G20 meeting in Rome yesterday did something really interesting, which was endorse a global minimum corporate tax of 15%. And Larry Summers, a prominent economist, I'm sure you've known him for years, argued in our paper this morning, this agreement is arguably the most significant international economic pact of the 21st century so far. It's built around a profoundly important principle. Countries should cooperate to raise corporate taxation, not compete to reduce it. And he argued that this is a triumph of Detroit over Davos. I'm very curious what you make of this move by countries together.
The optimal tax theory is very well developed. Larry has a famous early paper on it. And basically, the optimal tax system for any country is something that looks very much like a value-added tax. And so a tax on capital, a tax on corporate income has no place in an optimal tax system. And it doesn't mean that you have to not tax the rich. You can have a very progressive consumption tax that have really, really high taxes on Mark Zuckerberg and so on. But the corporate tax, the optimal corporate tax, is zero. And so what's been happening in the world is that countries all around the world have been shifting their tax system to value-added taxes, except for the U.S., and reducing their corporate taxes. So back in '94, the U.S. was the last country on earth to increase the corporate tax. It just went from 34 to 35% under Bill Clinton. At the time, the OECD average was 39.6%. Now the OECD average is like 20%, and there's kind of a race to the bottom. But the race to the bottom is a good thing, because what's happening is that countries are replacing inefficient tax codes with more efficient tax codes, and that's good for the prosperity of everybody in those countries. And so, in fact, the typical country in the OECD has, since '94, cut its corporate tax rate 3 times, because once they do it, they see the economic growth, they see the wage growth, just like we had after President Trump's experiment with it, and then they say, oh, I should do that again. And so the problem is that that there are ideological people who think that you have to have a corporate tax, even though it has no place really in an optimal tax design. And then the U.S. itself has a really, really foolish system where we allow people to sort of park their money overseas in low tax countries and not pay tax on it in the U.S. until they bring it home. And so Larry's right that the U.S. tax system has fundamentally been a disaster for U.S. workers, because it gives U.S. corporations a very strong incentive to locate activity overseas. But for me, the easy way to address that is what we did with President Trump, is just lower the rate, so that the lower rates abroad don't look so attractive. And so we cut the rate to 21% from 35%, and then all of a sudden people had a much smaller incentive to invest in some other country. Now, what the Biden administration wants to do is raise corporate taxes, despite the very positive evidence that we had showing how effective the tax cuts were after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017. But if he does that, then once again, all the jobs are going to flee the United States, just like they did during previous administrations. And so what they've been trying to do is strong arm other countries into lifting their taxes too. I think that that's kind of a fool's errand, that people say they're going to do it, but in the end, people will defect, because if everybody else has a high corporate tax and then you lower your corporate tax, then all the businesses are going to move to your country. And if you look at all the economic growth that Ireland had, for example, by being a tax haven, that's the attractive outcome for a country that's having a problem with its growth once everybody else agrees to do this. And so I predict that everyone's going to say nice things about this, but in the end, they're going to be defectors, and the defectors are going to sort of blow up this view where there's going to, you can stop the international tax competition.
We'll see about the defectors. So let me ask you about the next thing in line for President Biden's trip abroad this week, and that's the meeting in Glasgow of the United Nations Climate Summit. I noted earlier in our program that you made reference to energy-saving devices in your own home. So I take it from that you think the danger of climate change is real, and that you want to take personal efforts to reduce your footprint. Talk a little bit about the sensible economic policies to deal with this. Specifically, if you would, the carbon tax. Carbon tax, the more I look at this, seems the most effective and rational approach. But what do you think as an economist?
Sure. David, I guess we've sort of known each other on and off for a couple of decades. You might recall that way back in the day when I wrote the book Dow 36,000, we passed 36,000 today with your friend Jim Glassman. That I was an advocate of a carbon tax, way back. And the thing that really bugs me, and it gets back to the sort of senseless conflicts that we have in society, that it's almost like the Hatfields and the McCoys rather than two political parties who care about their country trying to run the country. Is the thing is that for climate change, it's so simple. If you have a carbon tax and then use the carbon tax revenue to reduce distortionary taxes, and so, for example, if the Democrats went to the Republicans and say, tell you what, we'll eliminate the corporate tax if you let us have a carbon tax, then you could, even if you don't believe in climate change, you could make the economy stronger, because a carbon tax is sort of like a value-added tax. It's kind of like a broad-based thing that isn't super distortionary. And so you could actually really improve the economy if you had a carbon tax and then you reduced marginal tax rates along with it. That's something that's well established in the economic literature. And so the real heartbreak of it is that that's a deal that you would think that politics could produce. That the Democrats would say, okay, guys, we'll impose a carbon tax, and you Republicans, we know you don't like it, but we'll let you have the revenue and do with it what you want. And if you did that, then you'd make an enormous amount of progress. But instead, what happens is whenever there's a proposal that comes up, like back in the day, Waxman-Markey, that in the end, it's just like one party trying to strong arm it through and keep all the revenue for themselves and so on. And so we haven't done the obvious policy. And I think it should be frustrating to everybody that we've made so little progress on it, when the answer is kind of so obvious. Once again, a carbon tax plus reduced other taxes increases the growth rate of the economy. Even if you don't believe in climate change, you should take the deal. And
so
the fact that we're not doing it is a wonder.
Given, Kevin, as you rightly say, your longstanding advocacy of this, I'm curious whether you ever proposed it to President Trump.
I never. We had a heck of a lot of conversations, but I never discussed climate change with him. But it was just not a policy that came up while we had so many things. And again, in the book, you can look at all the things that somehow the Council of Economic Advisors and I got involved in, from immigration to Middle East peace to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to deregulation. And our plate was really, really full. But no, I did not. I did not ever meet with him and talk about carbon taxes.
So let me ask about this week's other big piece of seemingly imminent economic news, and that's likely congressional passage of the 1.2 trillion, roughly, infrastructure bill and social spending bill, we sometimes refer to as the reconciliation bill, on the order of $1.75 trillion. I'm curious about the two elements of that in the context first of whether they're likely to enhance some of the basic fundamentals that are necessary for our capitalist economy to thrive, what you think are mistakes in that package, what you think of the climate change provisions as somebody who cares deeply about that issue from what you said. Just to talk us through your response to what's likely coming.
Right. Well, again, on the infrastructure bill, we spent a lot of time working on infrastructure. I had a whole chapter in the first economic report of the president that my team and I wrote on infrastructure. We found that President Trump's infrastructure plan, which was quite a bit different from this bill we're looking at, would add maybe about 0.1% per year to economic growth over the next decade. There was definitely positive growth effects from it. And infrastructure in the U.S. is, substandard in many places, and we could make the economy stronger if we improved it. The question is, why is our infrastructure so poor? And I think that the problem is that politics gets caught up in it. I guess we can't begrudge politics; it's how we run our country. But politics gets caught up in it, and we make really irrational choices. And so right now we have this terrible supply chain problem, but the infrastructure bill really doesn't do much at all to help it. That we're not going to really fix the supply chain problem by giving $88 billion to Amtrak. And so, my view is that infrastructure spending, I wrote a piece at National Review about this, that it's something that is probably like one of the better things that the government does with your money. And so even if you're a right-wing conservative, you shouldn't begrudge it too much. You could wish that it was smarter and better. But it feels like that never happens. And I have an episode of the book where I talk about my efforts on this, but there's this thing called the Jones Act, which is just like one of the most harmful regulations that there is on the books that pretty much makes it so that there's almost no shipping in the U.S. And so, if you want to move something from one port to another port in the U.S., then it has to be a U.S.-made ship that's got a U.S. crew. And of course, U.S.-made ships and U.S. crews are a lot more expensive than the ships that everybody uses internationally. So there's basically, the U.S. has the lowest share of freight on water of any developed country because of the Jones Act. And I worked really, really hard to get the Jones Act overturned. I think I had President Trump pretty much convinced about it. But in the end, the political forces supporting it are just too powerful. And so the problem I have is the infrastructure bill that you're looking at is sort of filled with, patches when the big solutions that one could think of are just basically not there because they're politically impossible.
And the social spending side of this, do you think there are portions of that, as on climate change, that will be helpful to our country, that will help the middle class, as is the stated intention?
I think the best way to help the middle class is the way that we did it during the Trump administration, which is to encourage businesses to expand, to cut corporate taxes so that there's a big increase in capital formation. That increases productivity, that drives wages up. Wage growth is picking up right now, but inflation is as well. In fact, real wages have declined this year pretty sharply because prices have moved faster than wages. I think that we're right now at a very dangerous moment. And this is something else that Larry Summers has talked about, where basically government has thrown all this money at increasing demand, in part in COVID relief packages. And at the same time, the Biden administration is attacking supply. And so if you juice up demand and cut back on supply with a big corporate tax hike, then it's a recipe for stagflation. And I think that's just about what we're starting to see in the data. I think economic growth has just about ground to a halt. I think, we had 2% growth in the third quarter, but it was all kind of inventories. And so that means the fourth quarter is looking like it could be even no growth at all, but really high inflation. And so for me, I think that really hurts the middle class. And so that the macro solution to it is to increase supply and not reduce supply.
We'll see what those growth numbers look like. I think your forecast is a little bit of an outlier from what I see, but we'll see. You, Kevin, a number of times have said, and I couldn't agree more, that we have a problem in our country in that our political debate is just so noisy and it's often not constructive. I want to ask you to speak frankly about President Trump and the Trump administration and the Republican Party's side of that, like every American, you watched what happened on January 6th. And I'm just curious about your own reactions as you watched that. What did you think was going on? What do you think we should do about that degree of really violent polarization in the country?
Yeah, the polarization of the country is terrible. And recall, I wasn't in the White House on January 6th, but I do mention quite a bit in the book. I talk about this, and this is the point about when I'm trying to fit Trump into like the broad swath of history, and I think that basically one of the things that Schumpeter didn't expect. Remember, I said that the universities would control the media, and they would control respectability, and people would be afraid to stand up for capitalist policies because they'd be marked as disreputable. That one of the things that Schumpeter didn't envision was the internet. And Marshall McLuhan, who I write a lot about in the book as well, did look ahead to the impact of the internet on things. And so, first of all, you're not going to get just like a curated bit of news where basically the Harvard faculty tells everybody what to think, which maybe is what happened when we were all watching CBS News when we were growing up. But instead, there's basically a competition for our attention. And what McLuhan thought was that the competition for attention would make it so that more and more kind of rude and crass people would be very adept at capturing our attention. And so I think that a lot of conservative friends, one of the first persons to interview me in my office when I went to the White House was George Will, and I know George doesn't have very strong feelings for the president, but a lot of people have this view: oh, I wish that I could have those policies, but why do you have to be so rude on Twitter? And I think that that question basically, I think, in some sense, assumes away the problem. So the problem is that we're now in this competition for attention, and the competition for attention is kind of driving us apart and making us meaner and meaner to each other, because that's kind of more fun for people to watch, kind of like a car crash or something. So I think that that is like something that's a major challenge for politicians going forward, because I don't want to insult anyone, but if you look at like how brilliant AOC is at getting attention on Twitter, I think it's a similar kind of thing. Like, so her policy proposals are very socialist and very very much consistent with the sort of ideas that I lay out in the book, and she does it with this sort of I guess vigor that's super attractive and interesting and fun for people to watch, and takes the attention away from the more moderate sort of 1970s or 80s Democrats.
So, Kevin, before we run out of time, because we're just about at the end of our half hour, I'm going to ask you a brief final political question. One of the interesting things in the book is you got to know Donald Trump pretty well. He started off, I gather, thinking you might be one of those globalists, but you ended up having a pretty good relationship. Do you think
you noticed the globe back there, right?
So do you think, based on what you know of him and your conversations, if you've had them, that he's going to run in 2024? And if he does, will you support him?
Yes. I don't have any inside information on this. I did want to make it aside that it's true that when I got there, I took a lot of criticism from Breitbart and other places because people thought of me as sort of a globalist. And so just to sort of mess with everybody, I got this globe behind me and stuck it on my desk in the White House. And so whenever anyone came to my White House, they had to look at a globe. And so, but despite that, I got along very well with the president. I have very high regard for him. And if you look at the book, you'll see that when you're actually down at the sort of problem-solving level, that he did a good job of stimulating debate and picking the right answer. He also, there's a human side to him, which you really don't see on Twitter, which I mentioned in the book, where like, one of my colleagues got cancer, and, he sent a little note to the person, saying, I hope you get well soon, and so on. And so I think that what it was really like, that part of the book, is going to be surprising for a lot of people, because, I really do think that he's this person on TV is quite a bit different from the person you see in private.
So what about
I think that he would be a good president. If he were to be reelected again. I think that like all new presidents, the first year, which you can read about in the book, was pretty chaotic. Going through a number of people at a pretty high rate of speed. But by the end, the White House was really well organized, had very strong processes, and produced really good policies. And I think that if he were reelected, that would probably happen again, and without the sort of chaos of the first year.
We've run out of our half hour. This has been a good discussion. I want to urge people to take a look at Kevin's book, which has a lot of interesting anecdotes about things that you've read about elsewhere. Kevin, thank you for joining us on Washington Post Live.
Thanks so much, Dan.
So please check out what we've got coming. We have a rich schedule of events this week. Go to WashingtonPost live.com to register for our programs. Thank you for joining us this morning.